It's a wonderful game that I hope all of you have played. In the other room, if you want to run right now, Eric and Robert are talking about Angband. So, and then after this, we're going to go till about 12:15, 12:20, because we started a bit late, and then we all get to go to lunch. And then make sure to come back from lunch on time, because we have great talks, and I probably have more announcements. Come over here. I don't know how to make it look nice.
Present mode is not.
Hey.
Have you lost the internet?
Sorry, everyone. Computers are hard, I guess. You did lose internet. Okay.
I haven't actually practiced this talk, so it might only be 10 minutes long. We might be fine.
I got it. Oh, you got it? Great. Great. Okay, now we are starting. Big round of applause for Zach.
Hi, I'm Zack Johnson. I'm the founder of Asymmetric, a small independent game studio. What we are largely known for is Kingdom of Loathing, which is a web-based MMORPG that came out in 2003. You might remember it if your junior high computer lab wouldn't let you run RuneScape. But what it has done is it has provided a very weird job for me and a lot of my friends for the last 13 and a half years. And since this is what it looks like, we've had to rely largely on its sort of charm and humor and writing. We've consistently employed more writers than programmers, which I think is fairly rare. We've done a lot of stuff with procedurally generated text and trying to make it funny, and that is what I'm going to talk about today. There's not any real thesis or thrust to this. It's more just these are some things that we ran into, some things that we did, and then that's it. So the way I see it, there's a couple different approaches to this. You can just randomly generate stuff, and somewhere in this list is the funniest knock-knock joke that has ever been written. But it's going to be really hard to find amidst all of the nonsense. And this is kind of how I feel about a lot of the sort of like Markov chain generated random text, and more recently the sort of recurrent neural network stuff, where it is funny, but a lot of times it's funny because it's nonsense, and so it's sort of difficult to use it for anything. An alternative approach is this, which this is always exactly as funny as the original source joke. How funny that is up to you, I guess, but we tend to try in Kingdom of Loathing to do stuff that is somewhere in between those two approaches. Very, very early on in KOL, we started doing this kind of stuff, so it's just very, very deep in the DNA. In the beginning, the game was very much just like, it would present a list of locations to you, and you could click on them, and then you would get a little story about what happened, which was all just written, nothing procedurally generated, and then it would make some stats go up or down randomly. The stats didn't really mean anything at first. You could get equipment and put it on, but it didn't do anything. Eventually, people were paying enough attention to it, and I was like, well, you know, I could make a game out of this, I suppose. So introduced a combat system, started doing a lot of things where you were actually fighting with monsters instead of just reading these stories. And so we needed a bunch of like metadata about the monsters, so like what their gender pronoun was, and for what they did to you as an attack, we just gave them a single verb. And we only ever, know, now that I think about it, if there are any verbs that don't work this way, but it was just a verb and you put an S on it and it makes it present tense, or he tries to do it without an S. All of that stuff was attached to the monster. They had gender, they had verb, but then the body part list just came out of this hard-coded array in the PHP script that ran the fight. And you can see from the end there, in the beginning, the tone of KOL was a lot more sort of Beavis and Buttheady than it ended up being as we all got older. That said, I think the inclusion of bung in this list turned out to be weirdly important because every screenshot of KOL that you see in a magazine or on an early website from like 2003, 2004, when the internet was paying attention to it, always showed bung in the body part slot in the combat message. So basically, you'd fight these monsters. It would generate a sentence that tells you what happens. Then it would pick a bunch of random sort of ouch noises that you've made and tell you what happened. When you hit them, it did a bunch of sort of like Batman noises, and this ended up being kind of a cool system to mess with because we could do a thing later where it's like, well, if you're hitting them with like a squeaky hammer, it can replace those with different kinds of noises, and then that's something new for you to see. And this was really rudimentary, but it was necessary. I think once we moved to this model where you were actually fighting monsters, it needed to just not be the same sentence over and over again. So this was at least like something that you could look at that was maybe funny some of the time. Eventually, we decided to make this great big multiplayer dungeon, and it was kind of modeled after early World of Warcraft raids. And so it's like, well, you're going to be fighting a lot of hobos leading up to a big hobo boss that you're going to fight. And the way that it made sense to implement this was that all of the sort of trash mobs, as WoW would call them, were the same monster. And so we were like, well, we really don't want this to just seem super grindy, so what if we just randomly generated the names of these things as you were fighting them? John Hodgman had recently published this book, The Areas of My Expertise, which had a big appendix that was 700 random hobo names. I mean, not random, I'm sure he actually wrote them. Got his permission to use that as a starting point for a name generator, which at that point looked like this. If you look closely at this code, which don't, you can see that a lot of the logic and indentation is also randomly generated. I like to describe KOL as a game with programmer art and artist code. So what this mostly does is it uses a function called misc_text, which pulls. So we have a data structure in the back end of KOL that is just a misc_text block, which is a bunch of just a text field in SQL. And the misc_text function just pulls a random line out of that. It has a few arguments that you can send to it, like give me one that starts with D or give me the fourth one or whatever. But for the most part, it's just pulling a random line out of a text field. And it became cumbersome to refer to these as misc_text blocks, so we started just calling them word buckets, which is the terminology that I will use for the rest of the time here. But this was a generator that would, I think this is way more on the like purely random side because there is a little bit of structure to it. It's always going to do like first name, last name, that kind of thing. And we took the John Hodgman data, separated it all up, and then added a tremendous amount of our own data because we had to do some things like some of the hobos had like hot elemental attacks, and so we wanted to give them different names that kind of reflected that stuff. And what we found was that people really, really liked it. Like the response to the randomly generated names were often so much better than the stuff that we had written on purpose that it was honestly kind of demoralizing. But even in generating just for this slide, randomly generating stuff, the first thing that it produced was Thoughtless Bill Clinton, the ladies' man. And so people were sharing screenshots with each other. It's like, hey, I found a hobo that was named after this friend of mine, and so, haha, this game says that you smell bad, and I just beat you up. And this sort of really showed us, I think, the potential for this in. It's a lot easier to have a computer write stuff than to have to write it all yourself. So especially if we're going to ask the player to do something really repetitive, like this is a nice way of differentiating things to make it interesting. So there's something more to look forward to when you fight the next monster other than just like your stats getting higher. So going back to that transition from when it was just a bunch of stories that you would get from clicking on something to actually fighting monsters, there was a really old early zone in KOL that all of the text that you got was just written in haiku, and that was another thing that like early press really latched onto because it was that period of time where something was funny just because it was a haiku. when we went to sort of modernize that zone, I thought, well, so we want to put monsters in there that you can fight as normal, but we want all of the stuff that happens in there to still be in haiku, which is fine. We could just write the description of the monster as a haiku. We can write the messages that they generate when they hit you, but all of the player's actions would not be in haiku. And I thought, well, what if we just tried to make it so we could throw the entire game into haiku output without concealing any information, because it just becomes impossible to actually play the game if you don't know what's happening, if they're abstracted out to just a joke. And I thought, well, all we have to do is categorize all the different kinds of text that the combat script is able to produce, and then write a bunch of haikus for each of those. And how many categories could there possibly be? And it turned out there were a lot. And what I didn't think of in the beginning was also haikus have a format, and that's why they're haikus, right? So if we're putting a number into a haiku, for instance, we're going to need to have a bunch of different variants on that haiku depending on how many syllables the number is. So had to write a function to figure out how many syllables were in a number. There was a lot of editorializing there and some internal arguments about 108. How many syllables is that? Is it 108? Is it 108? Is it 108? Is it 108? Was one guy? Fired that guy. So this was fine. This was just writing a function, deciding how many syllables were in a number, and then it could generate all of these. Eventually, it got to the point where it's we'll put the information in sort of hover text when you mouse over that if you really want to know how many hit points you lost. But we only had so much time before we had to release this feature. The other thing is, you get a lot of items in the game, and because we eventually decided that we wanted this mode to not only be available in the haiku zone, but anywhere in the game, which meant that any item that you could get anywhere in the game needed to be presented like this. So this time we actually had to count the syllables in the names of all of the items in the game, which now we're at almost 10,000 individual items. At the time it was only 4,000 or 5,000. Coincidentally, this was also right around the time we decided we should get an intern for the first time. But you can see here, there's a lot of stuff happening here, like the AN and the AN in capitals, just because a bunch of code, because it was very important to us that the writing be at least grammatically correct, right? So a lot of early KOL code was centered around making sure that things if you're fighting a monster that is a group of monsters, there was a sort of markup for making sure that the messages made sense for you to be fighting more than one thing as opposed to just one. Some of the items' names started with vowels and some of them started with consonants, so there needed to be processing for that. And we hadn't really standardized all of this, which led to us standardizing a lot of this using this function called Mad Lib, which even that eventually sort of showed its limitations, because right here, what if you wanted it to be an aardvark from Nantucket? Or what if you wanted the bucket that was replacing place to say random colorville? So we added some features to it like AN to just automatically put an A or an N before whatever thing it pulls out of the bucket. Capitalize to make sure that the capitalization was correct for a proper noun if you were building a proper noun out of something that wasn't a proper noun. And then a bunch of text processing things for just making things fit into sentences. The singular and plural just used a sort of generic markup that we had for sometimes it would change the output based on whether the function's called genderized, because it would change the output based on whether the player was male or female, the character was, but then also was used for singular and plural in a lot of different places. And so that didn't always get used, but it was a feature that we had there. And then state tracking for inside of a given iteration of the madlib function. So if we wanted to say, we wanted a lizard to not be blue with blue stripes, so we would ask for two colors that were unique, and it would know not to use the same one over again. Reuse was the opposite of that. If we did want it to use the same random thing that it had pulled out before, it would just store a variable in memory that kept track of what the function yielded the last time it ran. Because it was recursive, we were able to do stuff like this, like the adjectives bucket could call itself. And so what that would occasionally do was, if the dice rolled just right, you would end up with a guy named Big Ugly Dan. And that's cool. I think the key is to build it in so that happens every once in a while, so that it is remarkable when it happens, and thus actually funny. If you'll indulge me for a second, I have not seen this movie, but I think that the name Paul Blart is pretty funny. And here's why I think it is. The name Paul is a very ordinary name. Probably somebody named Paul in the audience, or at least you know somebody named Paul. The name Blart, however, very silly. When you put them together, the juxtaposition of the ordinary name and the silly name results in what I think is pretty funny. So I wrote this generator mostly to illustrate another feature of our generators that I'll tell you about in a second. But this was just, there was a place where you were fighting a bunch of security guards while you were trick-or-treating, and we just wanted to make sure that they had names that were evocative of Paul Blart. So either silly first name, normal last name, or vice versa. When I was doing this, I remembered we have this sort of internal rule that if what we're doing is generating a person's name, the generator has to be capable of generating Bob Goldthwait as a name, which results in some stuff, like, for instance, that is a sort of a normal first name and arguably a very normal last name, but it's funny if the guy's not named Bob Goldthwait. So the state tracking that was just built into the Mad Lib function ended up not being, it was powerful, but it didn't allow us to do anything that really meant anything in terms of gameplay. We had, in the meantime, developed this scripting language that we used to sort of let the writers do more code themselves without having to actually know PHP. And that had a more sort of fundamental kind of state tracking that let us actually store data about the player. So Riff Connor, our writer and designer who's been with us since nearly the beginning, made this thing that basically randomly generated an entire GameFAQs article about an imaginary video game. So it had, and Chris Moyer, our programmer, figured out a way to have it on, like, randomly select an ASCII art font and generate a big header for it that's different every time, and based on what the generator comes up with, it had, like, a lot of controls. I think it was a mistake on the developer's part to map tab to both run and plumber mode, because sometimes you want to run but not be a plumber. But the thing that, so this ended up being like 1,500 lines of script that Riff wrote, which led us to change the engine to support more than the number of lines of script that it supported before. But something that it was able to do, just because it was originally designed for dialogue with NPCs and stuff, and we needed to be able to store, like, what you had done and what you had said to them, and if you learned things. So it sets states on the player rather than just for the duration of the execution of the generator. So we've described these zones, and then it actually builds out zones in KOL that you can play through and puts the monsters that are described in there. So here you end up with the diseased skeleton superstars and the hopping bat bodyguards and especially narrow clown warlords. And then at a certain point when you're playing in that zone, it throws you into a maze, and you have to, like, have read this to know how to get through the maze, because there's just no other way to do it. And so that ended up being the kind of culmination of how random text generation fed back into the game in a way that this is sort of the most complicated version of it that we have in there. This was the point where I realized that this really was just kind of a story about a bunch of stuff that happened, and that was the last one. So in conclusion, this is who I am and where to find me and where to find our stuff. Google Slides was kind enough to make this a link we can all click. But I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has, or I'm also happy to go to lunch.
Hi, could you talk about the randomly generated puzzle that was in the original Naughty Sorceress's tower with the guards and the? You remember that one? Yeah.
Yeah, there was so this was another thing that Riff wrote. It was when you got to the original kind of end game of KOL was this weird sort of more adventure gamey kind of thing that didn't really tie into a lot of the game mechanics. It's since been replaced with something that I like a lot better. Players probably prefer the old one because they're players. That's what happens. So you would reach a room where there were 3 guards, and one of them always lies, one of them always tells the truth, and one of them craves the taste of human flesh. And they would between them say a bunch of stuff about what the combination was to a lock that you had to open to get to the next room. And it was just a sort of a it would randomly generate the code and then randomly generate things that they would say that you had to figure out, which one was lying and which one was telling the truth to get through it. We've done a bunch of. There have been a lot of times when we have wanted to make puzzles or challenges in the game that you couldn't just go to the wiki and look up how to do it. We've eased off on that a little bit because it's, honestly, like, it was a lot more interesting to us as designers than I think it was to the players, but that was just one of the ways that we tried to do it. It was by putting in puzzles that could be randomized like that. Something, if the answer is just a number, it can be any number. But yeah, there's a few things like that. There's some like sort of mazes that you go through that we procedurally generate, so they're a little different every time. What ends up invariably happening is somebody just writes a Grease Monkey script to automatically solve it for you, so that's effectively the same as you looking it up on the wiki. So we've sort of just the game's easier now than it used to be.
Couple of things. First, do we all get mystery accessories for attending this talk?
I don't know, how much did the ticket cost?
Actual question. This is an opportunity for you to tell us all about the NetHack theme dungeon in Kingdom of Loathing.
Oh yeah, so we did do a zone few years in that was NetHack themed. It would start out, you would just be fighting a bunch of actual letters and the objects that would drop, like you found a plus sign or you found an exclamation point, and what is that? And then eventually you would solve a puzzle in there that would allow you to talk to an oracle, at which point all of the monsters became the names of the monsters that they were in NetHack. We did actually do some procedural gameplay stuff in there. There were a bunch of different potions that were just described by the NetHack potion adjectives, and there was a set of effects that was associated with them, but it was randomized on a per player basis, so it was different every time. But yeah, that's just, Kingdom of Loathing is obviously not a roguelike, but I spent a lot of time playing ADOM and playing Hack and playing NetHack, and so it was hugely influential, and that was just a way of putting in a kind of an homage to it.
Hi. Have you ever entertained the idea of localization of your game, or is that a giant black hole?
Yeah, I don't think that it would be worth it. It's one of those things where it would be, well, so much of the text is just embedded in PHP files from like before we sort of learned how to write good code, that it would be a huge hassle to localize. And also because so much of it is like wordplay and pun based, I think that really it's a game that just has to be played in English.
So with that in mind, has anyone ever tried to play Kingdom of Loathing through Google Translate?
I don't know. I think that we're going to figure out how to do that and stream it later.
As a game with a very comprehensive wiki, as you mentioned, what do you think about the interplay between procedural content generation and archival storage in wikis and whatnot?
The KOL wiki is usually pretty good about recognizing when something has been procedurally generated and like writing down lists of possibilities or giving a bunch of examples. It's a good question because I like the idea of those generators in their functional form being a thing that's preserved. I mean, I like everything being preserved, but that is a thing that just a document about a game can't really express about it. I mean, you end up with something like I really appreciated Darius Kazemi wrote this article, like a blog post, where he described the level generation algorithms of Spelunky, which I think is just a really fascinating companion document to the actual game. And it would be way easier to write that about this kind of stuff. You just put in, we could just print out all of the word buckets, and then you'd be able to reconstruct everything based on that. Because even the structures are just a different bucket that contains the structure for the stuff. The GameFAQs thing is a little trickier because that's just sort of written in a weird scripting language. It's a little hard to parse. Probably even for the guy who wrote it, it's hard to parse because it's been a while, and that one of the things about that scripting language is that it doesn't have the concept of blocks. Like you can't, everything is just a single line of code that either executes or not. And so any complicated logic has to be done with go-tos because we're good programmers. And but yeah, it's interesting because random generation of stuff is kind of a barrier to archival, and I think it makes it even more important that when stuff like this is being preserved, that it be preserved in a playable form.
One more question? Anyone?
How will you preserve Kingdom of Loathing in a playable form?
That is a great question. Hopefully we won't have to for a while. But I'm guessing that it wouldn't be that tricky, and I'm sure that this already exists, like just to be able to make an executable that pretended to be a web server, pretended to be able to run PHP and MySQL on the back end. I'm sure that there exists something that could encapsulate a web app and run it offline. It's something that we've actually looked into because that's sort of been the only thing that we were ever good at until we finally hired a Unity guy, so now we can make a real video game, which we're doing now. If you want to play a stick figure cowboy game, we might be your only bet starting next year, unless somebody beats us to market with that hot concept. But yeah, I mean, I think I would definitely be into the idea of making a standalone version of it, but since it's still a living game and still has people playing it, there's not a point at which it makes a ton of sense to do a snapshot of it, and that's the point at which, you would do something like that.
Yay.
All right, thanks everybody.
Cool.